Smoov and Curly on video.
How did you like the episode, Charles? What happened? I'm right now playing a video game called The Stanley Parable, and he's a office worker who does repetitive work. And one day he realizes that everyone in his office complex is gone. That's kind of how I feel right now. He has a narrator that kind of is in his head and tells him what to do, which is interesting because that's kind of a theme of the episode of WestWorld that we watched. It's Charles.
Hey.
Backstory to me was kind of the theme, or an important theme, and I was gonna ask you if you wanted a worthy backstory.
I'd like to think I have a worthy backstory, or at least a complicated one. Although maybe I don't. Maybe I just have an undifferentiated feeling of guilt that will never be resolved.
I've a couple times I've tried to get onto game shows. I've applied to be on game shows, and one of the things they really, really, really want is a worthy backstory. And they're like, "What do you, where do you come from?" I'm like, "I don't know, my house." Like, and they want to know, "What are you going to do with this money if you win?" I was like, "I don't know, put it in the bank. Maybe I'll make a video series about computer science." And they're like, "Oh, like that's not very relatable. They'd rather me want to like buy a fur coat or,
because that way people can see themselves in you.
the game show people always say no.
My backstory is that I've never been able to get on a game show.
I'm deprived of a backstory. All I need is if I can win this, if I can just win this game, I will use it to buy myself a backstory.
By the way, I like this idea of backstory for a couple of reasons. One, because, well, it was kind of the central theme, but it also is a nice metaphor for what I thought of was the kind of key technical gem that got dropped on us in this episode. That the problems we are seeing now are a result of very early design decisions by Arnold because he wanted to create consciousness. And so all of those decisions and architecture were structured around that. And the legacy, what we're dealing with now is the legacy of those poor design decisions.
Is that what people call technical debt?
Because I'm actually not sure what it means.
I'm not sure what it means either, but people use it in exactly this context. It's like you make early decisions that put you in a hole later. Now, it's often used, I think, to mean, you cut some corners, right? You're like, well, I'm going to just store this in a file. I'm not going to store it in a database because there's a lot of overhead in trying to do that.
Well, and the way we try to get around that is by creating abstractions. But of course, the desire to create abstractions for long-term flexibility always runs up against the need to optimize for what you happen to know is actually going on. Here, that's the problem that we sort of have. They built this kind of voice talking to you. This is how you interact with the thing and with the hosts. And so that's the main. Now he says, Hannibal Lecter says that the only remnant are the commands that we use to interface with the hosts. But actually, I don't think that's true. The remnant is the entire architecture is built up from that, and it drives the things that you do and that you don't do. I mean,
right. And what becomes easy for the system, how it fails, how it's robust, and how it's easy to extend,
and how it's easy to exploit and destroy, which is what's happening.
Yes, and the security. Yes, that's exactly right. So do you get a sense that someone is trying to exploit it, or is it just falling apart? Like I had thought that, so it's Robert Ford. I tried to be really careful about learning the character names this time. I wrote them down in my file. So Robert Ford is Hannibal Lecter.
Is that a database?
It's not. Actually, it's a Google Doc.
You will regret that later.
Yeah, I made some architectural decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But it was so easy to get started.
Yep, there you go. That's how they get you.
But anyway, the point is that Dr. Ford, is the guy's name.
He seemed more Hannibal Lecter this episode than in previous episodes.
In the many episodes we saw before this, which I think was 2.
Yes.
I can't believe we're only on episode 3. So and episodes 1 and 2, my sense was, okay, he's the one who's trying to make these things become alive and give them humanity, right? He's the force behind the scenes that's kind of pushing things in this really scary direction. But he revealed pretty solidly in this episode that it wasn't him, that he believes that they're just machines. And he was quite aggressively dismissive to employees that were giving them a little bit of humanity.
Bernard is actually, well, we are currently being set up to believe that in some sense, Bernard is the tragic villain at the middle of this. I'm tragic, one, because he doesn't realize what he's setting up.
Right. He doesn't want to hurt anybody. He says something like, let's just see where this goes.
Well, but also, no, yes, but also this is the way he's processing the death of his son. I was very happy to meet his ex-wife.
Yeah, she was from Firefly.
I love seeing her. I'm always happy when she gets work. I hope we see more of her.
So, all right. So we got updates on Dolores, who I wrote is the rancher girl host, because I feel like repeated rape victim is not a great description.
Everything that is happening to her is terrible. The Chekhov's the Chekhov's gun thing was amazing. You know what Chekhov's gun is?
I do. Why don't you see? But our viewers might have forgotten since the last time it came up.
So Chekhov's gun is a trope. If you see a gun in the opening scene, you will see that gun must be used. This episode literally starts with the Chekhov's gun, right? She's in her room. She sees a gun wrapped in cloth and she looks at it. The camera lingers on it long enough so that you know that it must be important. And what's interesting in this case is she puts it in the drawer. She stares at herself in the mirror, and then she goes back to the drawer and the gun is gone. And at the time I thought, wait, guns don't just disappear. Was she remembering something? What was happening there? And then we find out later what actually happened.
What happened?
Well, what happened at the very end, right, is that the gun was in the barn. I assume, I could be wrong, that while she was staring at herself, what we actually didn't realize is that she basically blacked out and took the gun over to the barn and hid it, because her story arc always ends with her being thrown in that barn and raped by someone. And they seem to spend a lot of time this episode showing us things that in some sense don't matter.
Right, that no people are watching.
Right, except we're watching. Right, we're watching. We are complicit in the whole thing. Right, we are just as much, participating in the WestWorld theme park as the people who are in the story participating in the WestWorld theme park.
Whoa! The episode is called The Stray, and part of what happens in it is the junior programmer goes with like a sort of cowboy, but not in the literal sense, person, a QA person, quality assurance person, into the park to retrieve a malfunctioning robot. And at one point he says or does something, and she's like, why would you do that? And he's like, maybe it's part of my backstory. And he was mocking the idea that he was that he might be a character in a story, but he was literally a character in a story.
But I do think the whole they're walking through trying to find him thing was dumb from a technical point of view. And I will just simply leave you with one acronym: GPS. Why do they not know where these things are? Why are you making these technical decisions? I mean, says the guy who I'm 100% sure, I'm trying to debug a system that I built at the beginning of COVID that was working fine, but then when I updated the OS, it's now broken and I can't figure out why. And I'm thinking, if only I had commented this and I could figure out why this is suddenly not working when it was working literally 27 seconds before. But seriously, GPS. It's because they used a linked list instead of an array, and they've been stuck with that decision since the very beginning. Was this avoidable by just having made slightly better software engineering decisions and architecture decisions, or not?
There is this notion that an early developer, really a significant developer, maybe the architect of the whole cognitive system, made some decisions early on that do have repercussions downstream that are more difficult to deal with. Like, I think that some of the stuff that's happening, as you're pointing out, would be fixed if they just had more careful processes in place. But
Sure.
you know, technical debt is technical debt. Like, I don't think you can just process your way out of that. The early decisions have later implications. So maybe we should spend a moment or two talking about those early decisions. Like, what did we get out of that? That description of the way that Arnold saw consciousness coming about.
You know, you have an inner monologue, and the program is the inner monologue. That I have a really hard time wrapping my head around that.
So there's a book that came out in 1976 that talked about the where consciousness comes from, and described this bicameral mind theory. And bicameral means like two chambers, and it's used to refer to, for example, the United States Congress that has these two different chambers that kind of, you know, work independently but also have to kind of coordinate. There's rules about how they get along. The theory goes that basically we have two brains in our head. We have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and they're basically, each of them could run a person, but we have them both in our heads, and they have to coordinate in some way. And so they coordinate through, in a sense, voices. They kind of talk to each other, and by formulating thoughts and ideas as kind of in a kind of linguistic form and then transmitting them to each other, that's where this notion of like this kind of inner dialogue, this inner monologue kind of comes about. And that's, we're not really sure what consciousness is, but to the extent that it has to do with this kind of watcher in your head that's seeing your life unfold and kind of viewing it as a narrative, that's what they're trying to explain, I think.
It has occurred to me once or twice that perhaps we are actually the two halves of the brain talking to one another. It's all bicameral.
So I wanted to talk about Arnold's pyramid of, I don't know, I called it self-actualization.
Yes.
They draw, Anthony Hopkins' character draws a little pyramid. And it's like at the bottom is memory, and then improvisation, and then self-interest, and then, I don't know, you profit.
And he actually says that he sort of doesn't know what it is, right?
Right. But that seems like a ridiculous choice to write it that way.
Now, you know, it's a ridiculous choice is using a blackboard. Why a blackboard? Why not a whiteboard? I mean, all that dust. They make some really strange architectural decisions. That's all I have to say.
So, all right. So memory, I think by memory, they meant not the fact that they're remembering stuff from previous iterations, but like scripted responses. The idea that they just have this, you know, a phrase or a chunk or a little action pattern that they could play out. Improvisation is more like generating a new response on the fly. Self-interest, we haven't really seen yet, but I think that's where we're going.
I think hiding a gun in the barn is a pretty good
early version of that.
By the way, I'm glad you brought this up because I actually didn't really notice what was on the pyramid. And this is interesting, right? Because Bernard.
You should pat yourself on the back.
Tells her to lose the scripted responses and to do improvisation only.
Because he wanted to know what she really thought, which is
interesting.
Very interesting.
I wonder if Bernard is not just, you know, setting up things with whatever, but is in some sense accidentally giving commands that are being taken, that are actually changing what the hosts do. So if you say, lose the scripted responses and go to improvisation only, he didn't say, okay, reset back to scripted responses. Did he permanently switch on, move up the hierarchy? Is he going to accidentally say something like, don't forget to worry about your self-interest? And now, you know, she moves up and then go, oh, and don't forget to do something vague.
Well, I think the top one is going to be actual self-consciousness and being alive, right? And that's when hopefully they'll go from self-interest, which is just let's protect ourselves, to like we're real beings deserving of rights.
The guy they were looking for, the stray, picked up a rock and did not attack her, but bashed his own head in. That's not a good portent. So that seems suboptimal. The other thing is, everyone is remembering, right? So you talk about the arc, not just of characters, but the arc in the story. We're seeing more and more people, or more and more of the hosts remembering past instances. This is a real problem, clearly, because, you know, the virus is spreading, right? And this seems like a really, this seems to suggest that we're going to be moving relatively quickly. The other thing we didn't do this time around, I mean, I think sometimes it's useful to ask ourselves what didn't get covered. The other thing that we didn't do this time is we didn't explore more about the corporation and what it's doing and what its goals are. I mean, a lot was actually revealed this episode, and a lot sort of happened. And the really big reveal, of course, was that Dolores hid the gun, apparently, and used it and broke
Right,
the
which she
story.
was programmed not to be able to pull the trigger, but she had to overcome that through the voice in her head.
Kill him. The voice said kill him, and that allowed her to overcome it. By the way, you'll notice that that's in direct contradiction to the command that she was given by Bernard earlier, which is return to your loop. Actually, it wasn't a command, it was a question. Are you going to return to the loop or something like that? And she says yes, but she didn't. It seems to me that we're supposed to figure out, or at least contrast RF's Hannibal Lecter-like comment that they only feel what we program them to feel or tell them to feel, with the apparent terror that Dolores feels when she's taken to the barn. I mean, it's the whole question of why are they doing these things that no one else gets to see? Why not just pretend they happen, right? I mean, the backstory never happened, and yet they have this kind of feeling of a backstory. So why not just, why not just freeze around the campfire until someone shows up and then just sort of dump into your head, here are the things that happen without having to actually experience them? On the other hand, is experiencing them any different from believing you experienced them?
I think that's the theme here, which is that it was an architectural decision made by Arnold early on, and now we're playing out the ramifications of it.
Well, anyway, I think that's the big question for us, right? I mean, of course, it's the big question for us, but I have this feeling, and I'm not going to eat these words later, that the next episode is crucial.